Right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to ANCLAS's latest seminar. Once again, I'm Sean Burgess, the Senior Associate with ANCLAS. I'm filling in for John Minns, who will allowing the rest because he's just got too much to do. Before we get going with today's seminar, just a quick piece of advertising for next week. We've got a book launch, sort of a new departure for ANCLAS a little bit, of the book Fire and Song by Ana Lanyon. And this is the story of Luis de Carvajal and the Inquisition in Mexico in the 16th century. So, again, it's on Thursday, this time 6 p.m. to about 7:30 thereabouts, and as usual, wine, nibbles, a bit of a talk on the book, and then I'll copy the book for Sam.
Yes, and the author will
the author will be here speaking, hence the book launch. Yeah. Today, we have Sarina Kilham with us, and she's going to be talking to us about social sustainability in the biodiesel production in Bahia, in the northeast of Brazil. Sarina has extensive experience working with questions related to development, particularly in Timor-Leste and Indonesia. We've worked with the United Nations, with the various NGOs, and the government of Timor-Leste. Right now she's working at the University of Technology in Sydney, and what she's looking at is very topical. You all know Obama is going to be in Brazil next week, starting from Sunday, and pretty much rock solid certain he's going to talk about biofuels. There's a big editorial on this by Marcos Yank, who's a heavy hitter in the agricultural world. Was talking about ethanol. Nobody talks about biodiesel. Very few people are talking about this, and it's, as we're going to hear, quite important. And more particularly, you could talk about the people who actually grow the crops that are used to make it. Lula and Aldona have wrapped the whole biofuel idea in a rhetoric of small producers and helping with agricultural development. And I suppose you're going to give us the truth to the story. So
right.
I will hand it over now to Sarina.
So thank you everyone for coming. My name is Sarina. I'm a PhD student at the Institute for Sustainable Futures in the University of Technology in Sydney. The research that I'm going to talk about today I conducted last year in 2010. I've already done this presentation in Sydney and Brasilia and Salvador on the same topic, slightly different for different audiences. And the research that I did in Brazil was with some support. So I did it with the Permaculture Institute of Bahia, ETC Energy, which is an organisation in Europe that looks at energy issues in developing countries, the Institute for Society, Population and Nature, which is a research institute based in Brasilia, as well as some help from my university. Just to give you some context about the research, I'm only going to talk about Brazil today, but my research is actually on Brazil and East Timor, or Timor-Leste, looking at how the experiences from Brazil in biodiesel production might be used for developing policy in other countries like Timor-Leste. And my initial interest in this topic grew out of the fact that I was working in Timor, and I saw that the government was starting some biodiesel production there after a visit to Brazil that the Brazilian embassy in Timor had funded. And I was really concerned that they were cherry-picking bits of the policy that they thought looked good that worked in Brazil and just implementing them in Timor. And that when I looked into it a bit more, I found there was lots of government press releases saying, you know, this is a really great thing for small farmers, and then NGO press releases saying this is a really terrible thing for small farmers, but very little in between and very little research actually at a farmer level, which is where my real interest lies. So I went to Bahia, which is in the northeast on the coast. This is kind of the area that I covered in the research. Not everywhere within that area, obviously. We went to about 10 different locations, and it was a little bit of serendipity, who we met, what contacts we had, where people in government passed us on to other people, where the refineries knew that farmers were growing. So we just kind of followed at the leads for a couple of months on looking for people to interview. So the reason I chose Bahia to look at from all of Brazil was in part because I had existing contacts within Bahia, but also because the farmers in Bahia are very poor farmers. The northeast of Brazil is one of the poorest areas of Brazil, and I felt that the farmers there and their lifestyles were most relevant to be able to take their experiences and compare that to Timor-Leste, as opposed to in the south of Brazil where it's much more big land areas, big monocultural crops. I didn't think that that model was really transferable to look at in Timor. So I'm concentrating on biodiesel, not bioethanol. They're two different types of fuel, and the biodiesel comes mostly from oily seeds. So it can be any type of oily seed, palm oil, canola, castor, jatropha. These are the typical ones that people talk about. So Brazil obviously is recognised as a world leader in biofuel production, but actually most of that is bioethanol, it's not biodiesel. Biodiesel makes up a very small percentage of the fuel that they produce. In 2005, the Brazilian government recognised that the benefits of biofuel weren't actually reaching small farmers, that they were mainly benefiting large landowners or people involved in monocultures, and that small farmers were continuing to be isolated. So they developed a program called Pro Biodiesel, and it was aimed directly at improving the lives of small farmers, especially based on the term social inclusion. So aimed at small farmers, regional development and positive environmental impact. So unlike with the ethanol, which is mostly based on sugarcane, they said we'll take any type of feedstock for this diesel. So if palm is more suited to your area, we'll take the palm. If castor is more suited to your area, we'll take the castor. The social fuel stamp provides tax incentives to the companies or the refineries, and then they receive this social fuel stamp. But to receive it, they have to meet the industrial producer has to meet some minimum criteria. So they have to purchase a minimum percentage of their feedstock from family farmers at different geographical points in Brazil. So for example, if they're purchasing their feedstock from Bahia, they get extra points as opposed to if they bought their feedstock from a large monoculture in the south. The producer must also enter into a legally binding agreement with the farmers to establish income levels, deadlines, delivery of this feedstock, and they also have to provide technical assistance and training. And so once they get this social fuel stamp, then they can get tax breaks. They also get the right to sell at the government auctions. The social fuel stamp is based on, and the policy, which is called, Brazilians refer to it as the PNPB, which is the National Biodiesel policy, really looks at social inclusion as one of the main bases of the policy. And it's based on this premise that whatever excludes people from society, if you rectify those things, you will include them into society, and really only looks at income, employment and access to technology. There's a bit of an assumption with this that just by rectifying income, employment and access that people will become socially included. In my research, I wanted to move away a bit from that limited understanding, and I decided that social inclusion is not necessarily the same as social sustainability, that I wanted to go beyond the limited view of social inclusion, because there are other definitions of social inclusion, which is more about having voice and power. So you can be socially included even if you choose not to participate in mainstream society, as long as you're actively having a voice and power to make that decision. In my research, I didn't actually define social sustainability too concretely, but left it open. We used a lot of narratives and open-ended questions with the participants for them to define themselves what they saw as social sustainability in their communities. Within the Pro Biodiesel program, there are already acknowledged challenges. We need to recognise that it's still very early days of the program. So whilst the policy has been in place since 2005, in Bahia, It's really only been operational since 2007, and the companies, the refineries and the government are all on a big learning curve with this program. A couple of companies, I know of at least one, attempted to establish themselves in 2007 in Bahia and closed down because they weren't able to keep up the contracts with the small farmers, and they didn't feel that the tax incentives were balancing the logistical issues of trying to buy the feedstock from multiple spread out people. So in my research, I actually also tried to look beyond these acknowledged challenges, because in part, when I visited in 2009 to undertake a scoping visit, I found that many of these challenges were attributed to the faults or the lacking on behalf of the farmers. So when contracts weren't fulfilled, the way that this was described to me was the farmers don't understand about contracts. The level of education in Bahia of our farmers is too low. The farmers don't understand about the cooperatives. There was very little, if any, acknowledgement from people that perhaps the policy wasn't fitting what the farmers needed. And I really wanted to move away from buying into that kind of dialogue about everything's not working because of the poor uneducated farmer. And I thought, well, actually the farmers are making active choices here in their lives. They're not just passive recipients, and I really want to go out and find out what the farmers think about the program. So my research had a farmer-led focus. All the interviews were with farmers or with local technicians who themselves came from a farming background, and some of them were receiving a salary as a technician but also maintaining their family farm or had family members on the farm. I looked for diversity, so across age, gender, location, farm size and primary crops. So I interviewed both people growing sunflower, castor and palm. But pretty much everyone was a family farmer. So I didn't stick strictly to the Brazilian government definition because the Brazilian government has very clear guidelines of how they classify a person as a family farmer, and it's X hectares of land and you're only allowed so many external labourers to come in and work on your land. But we did focus only on small farms, people who were on their farm, farming it themselves, possibly farming it with extended family. And so what I'm going to cover next is what I thought were some of the key emerging themes that came out of my interviews. I haven't done all my analysis yet because I've only just kind of got back about 6 months ago. But these were the big themes that really struck me and struck my co-researchers in Brazil. So the first one is about agricultural diversity, that all the farmers pretty much recognise the importance of diversification of crops for food security and for resilience to market and climate fluctuations. So often we heard from people that they needed to plant a little bit of everything, that they needed a greater diversity of plants to get different returns over the year. And also stories of social ties linked with the exchange of products. So people were growing things that weren't necessarily about profit, but were really linked to their social and cultural location. So for example, corn. Lots of people were growing corn at the time we were visiting because it was coming up to São João, and people said, well, we have to have corn because it's São João. We don't do much else with the corn, but we can't imagine not growing it. São João is a festival that happens once a year, and it's all about getting back to your roots and back to the countryside, and there's lots of country dancing that goes on. So the relevance of this issue of agricultural diversity to the biodiesel program is that whilst the policy encourages intercropping in theory, we also heard lots of stories about monocultures coming out. So for example, with sunflowers, there was one area we visited, Olindina, which is kind of to the north of Bahia, next to the next state. And people were saying, yeah, the cooperatives come and tell us to intercrop, but actually the sunflower does much better if it's monocropped. And one person had done a little trial area of their farm of it monocropped, and then all their neighbours were copying them. With palm, in the area we interview people who are going to grow palm, you can only intercrop the palm for the first 4 years. After 4 years, the trees are too big and they will actually shade out and their roots take water from other plants, so you can't physically intercrop them. And with the castor, whilst farmers at the moment were still intercropping, we heard lots of stories that the price of castor is so good that people are starting to monocrop with it. So there was a big gap we felt between what the policy officially said and what we heard stories of farmers starting to do and moving into monoculture, which we think is quite dangerous. And I think it raises the question of, if the program's focusing on strengthening family farming and diversity, there's no actual control mechanism within the program or policy to stop monocultures happening. The next one was about introduction of species. The farmers haven't yet mastered many of the techniques of cultivation, and many of the technicians who were responsible for extension services also didn't know very much about the crops that they were encouraging people to grow. So for example, we met one family where all their sunflower was eaten by migratory birds. They had no idea how to control it, and their technicians in the cooperative had no idea how to control it. There's an economic side to the introduction of new species. So with the sunflower and palm, farmers are being encouraged to take loans from the banks to buy the seeds, to plant these crops that nobody really knows how they're going to turn out in their area. So the financial risk, the economic risk of going down that path is actually being put with the farmer. The financial risk is not being put with the cooperatives. And of the family that had migratory birds eat all of their sunflower crop, their eldest son had actually migrated down to São Paulo to work as a labourer, because the loan had been taken out in his name. He lost the crop, he didn't make any money, he had to pay back the loan somehow, so he did what most other young men do in Bahia, which is go and work as a labourer in the south. One of the palm farmers, so the palm hasn't yet been introduced, but they've at the stage of encouraging farmers to go along to meetings and signing up for being part of the program. The farmers were very suspicious, I guess is the best word I can think of, about this, because they were being told that they couldn't use any of their local palm or any palm that comes from Bahia or Brazil to produce for biodiesel production. They were told that they needed to buy the seedlings at 6 real per seedling, and take out a loan of somewhere between 6,000 to 8,000 real just to get the seedlings, and that these were special seedlings that had been bred to have like high oil content. But amongst those farmers, they felt like they were being asked to enter into big financial risk to buy an introduced species when they felt that there was a perfectly good local species that had no financial risk for them. The other thing is that there's a social impact of these introduced species. So with the palm especially, we heard lots of stories that women won't be able to work in the palm once it's in, because it will be too heavy, it's not women's work. And this led us to start to think about, well, how is this going to change the social dynamic in these areas if all these farmers, who at the moment lots of them are female farmers as well, if they start relying on a crop that women can't act as labourers in. Technical assistance came up pretty much from everyone. We heard some very funny stories about technical assistance, especially from the technicians and from other people, which was basically that the technicians rock up on their motorbike, flip up the visor on their helmet, yell out, "Hey, did you plant the seed we dropped by last week?" And then someone would give the thumbs up and the visor goes down and off they go again. And that was the extent of technical assistance that the farmers were receiving. So everyone felt that technical assistance was really, really important for small farmers. That's how they access information. but that the level that it's happening at the moment is really superficial. From the technicians, we heard that the technicians are also learning from and with the farmers. But again, this isn't reflected adequately in the policy or the program. So the technicians were actually great contacts for us. They would often take us out to farmers, and of course then we'd spend a couple of hours in the car with them chatting. And all the technicians just had this like fantastic attitude to farmer learning and to their own learning as farmers. But there's no mechanism for that within the program. It's all just one way, that the technician has to give the information to the farmer. There's no mechanism within the program of, well, how do the farmers give that information back to the technician, and does that feed back to the cooperative to change people's practices? So it's good that the technical assistance is in the program, but it could be greatly improved. The next issue we came across was about cooperatives. So there's two ways for the biodiesel program to get down to the level of small farmers in Bahia. Number one is that the refinery who wants to get the social fuel stamp and the tax incentive, they can send their own technicians down to the farmers and make their contract directly with the farmers. But this hasn't been such a successful model. What we saw as more successful is the refineries contract the cooperative, and then the cooperative sends their technicians down to the farmer and they make the contract directly with the farmer. However, what we found is that many of the cooperatives are highly dependent on these contracts from the refineries or the government as their primary source of income, and that very few farmers knew what a cooperative was or were aware that they were a member of the cooperative. The cooperatives were referred to as the company, the government. When we asked people, are you a member of any associations or cooperatives, we would hear about church groups, we would hear about small local groups, but no one ever mentioned that they were a member of the cooperatives that were dealing with biodiesel. So they felt that the cooperatives were external to them. So the fact that the investments being made by the cooperatives didn't mean that the farmers were having any sense at all that they were participating in a cooperative. Most people weren't conscious of their rights or their duties as a member. We did not meet one person who was a paid-up cooperative member, and some of the cooperatives admitted to us that at this stage they weren't collecting like membership dues for the cooperative, that would come later. So it's cooperative in name, but it's not cooperative in nature. So for me, this raises questions going back to the basis of social inclusion of this policy, is how do you create real farmer participation in something that's autonomous? Because one of the cooperatives admitted they had originally been contracted to one of the refineries. The refinery had failed and decided to pull out of the state, and the cooperative had almost collapsed because that was where their true funding came from, and now they had renegotiated a contract with the government, and that was how they had survived. So the cooperatives are a very fragile state, I think, at least in Bahia. A result that struck us was the frequency of responses that the children of the farmers we interviewed did not want to stay in the country, did not want to stay on the farm, and nor did their parents want them to stay. Some farmers were extremely proud to be a farmer, and in theory would have liked their children to continue their profession, but they didn't see that the farm offered a real future to their children. And this was given for reasons of lower income, that the city had more to offer, including better facilities for study and professional employment, and that lack of basic education, health, water, sanitation, and electricity was a major concern both for families and for young people. And this young man that we interviewed said, who wants to be a farmer? Everyone wants to be a doctor. Everyone wants to go to the city and play football. There's no fun being 15 and going out weeding every day. This concerned me that this came up so often, especially looking at some of the Brazilian government or the Bahian government press releases which say the biodiesel program is keeping farmers in rural areas. And we didn't hear any stories of that. Linked with this was the social value given to farming and to farmers. And many of the farmers felt that there was a lack of appreciation of their society about the work of a farmer as a profession and also as a way of life. People felt that greater value needed to be placed on farmers and that it wasn't about income, it was about how other people looked at you as a person, as a human being, that you could have respect and honour being a farmer, that you weren't seen as some type of country hick or country bumpkin. Gender came up. Because biodiesel is a fuel made from agricultural crops, we always expected to find a gender dimension in it, but the policy fails to mention gender at all, really. And because of the social inclusion goals, there's kind of two gender parts to it that need to be looked at. So what are the issues related to crop changing and labour and on-farm gender issues, and also what is the social inclusion gender outcomes that might change because of this policy. So what we kind of found was that not all plants will have the same impact on women as they will have on men. So for example, sunflower, palm or castor, we heard that the palm is dangerous and physically demanding, so women will be mostly excluded from doing this work. We heard that the sunflower requires a lot of weeding and a lot of extra attention, and that work was falling to the women to undertake. We heard that some of the cooperatives were offering machines that take off the husk from the castor bean. And traditionally that's been women's work, so the man might go out and collect the castor and then the women sit and dehusk them. So I'm not really saying that these are going to be good impacts or negative impacts, but just that it's time to acknowledge that there will be gender impacts within this program. And finally, it was about the quality of life. So in the beginning interviews, when we started hearing these responses from people saying, we don't want our kids to stay on the farm and we don't think society values us as farmers, we started asking people, well, what would make you feel that you wanted your kids to stay in farming, or what would make you feel that your community could become vibrant again? And while some people talked about incentives and income, so we need some incentives from the government, which was available as saying we need some more money, actually what came up much more often was about education, local opportunities in education, local opportunities in small industry, so local processing of agricultural goods, leisure and sports. The young people mentioned that they needed something to do on the weekends rather than drink or dream of going to the big city. Cultural activities, internet access, radio and television, these things were equally as important to people wanting to stay in their communities as having an increased income. So I've got a little DVD that I might show now. If anyone wants to get in touch with me or read the report that we wrote for ETC on this, they're my contact details. I'll put them up again at the end. This runs for 20 minutes, this video.
Então, eles vêm aí umas 2 vezes na minha roça, sempre vai plantar, orientar.
Sorry, I'll just go back to the menu. Sorry, I don't know why it's starting at that point. want to know how to get the menu to come up on it, rather than it just, here we go.
Não sabia o que era. Mas quando eu era mamãe, sabia que ela dava um óleo na mão, para quem ninguém sabia, né? Aí veio esse biodiesel aí, né? Então foi um incentivo a mais para nós produzir. Onde foi em 2000.
So that video is actually up for free download on Vimeo. We just edited it ourselves. We shot it on a Mac doing little like HD camera like that one, and edited it on the Mac. So if anyone's interested in watching it or sharing it, I don't think the link's there, but I can give you the link. So now I guess is question time. I've tried to keep my talk kind of broad and cover a little bit of everything because I wasn't kind of sure who was going to turn up or what people's interests would be. I'd like to say I had heaps of fun doing the research. Like, it was just so great to go to Bahia and to talk to the farmers, and it was a really excellent time.
Do you want to grab a seat for the question?
Yeah,
Stay there.
I'd like to sit down if that's okay.